Afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation to talk at this conference. I'm not sure whose idea it was to invite me, but thank you all the same. And I must say I'm delighted to be here. It's my first visit to India, and hopefully not the last, because I'm not here for very long. I'm going to be talking to you about a particular issue in respect of South African water law, which is, as you could probably imagine, a huge area all in itself. And that is just looking at some of the pollution issues that are facing South Africa at the moment and the legal dimensions that relate to them. Now, obviously, many of these issues are peculiar to South Africa, but I think the problems, as well as the ways in which those problems are being addressed or ignored, as the case may be, may have resonance in a number of other countries, particularly, I think, developing countries. Just to put the presentation into some kind of context, this is a map showing water availability in the country. I won't explain it in detail, but essentially South Africa is water scarce. Our average annual rainfall is significantly less than the world average. Most of the country to the west, which is similar in a lot of ways to the US, is arid, whereas most of the rainfall falls in the east. The areas there that are coloured in the warmer colours, orange, yellow, red, are countries that are areas of the country that are already suffering from water stress or are very close to getting to that point. The lighter colours, the blues and the greens, are countries where there is some water excess at the moment, but the projections are within about 10-15 years. Most, if not all of those areas will be subject to water stress. In other words, there will be an excess of supply over demand. So there are a variety of mechanisms that are being considered as to how to address that. Now, what exacerbates that situation is the fact that a lot of that water that is available is suffering from severe water quality issues. And the sorts of water quality issues that are or have been referred to as priority water problems are those. And I'm just going to be looking at two of those today, or two sources of some of the problems that are in that list. The two issues that I'm going to look at are wastewater treatment and acid mine drainage. And those are both responsible for several of the water quality problems that appear on that list. So the first focus then is on wastewater treatment, and without limiting the effects of inadequate wastewater treatment, it leads, amongst other things, to eutrophication, which is an enormous problem in South Africa, particularly in our many impoundments, dams, and bacterial and viral pathogens, which hopefully I won't need to explain. Now, the Department of Water Affairs has carried out several studies in respect of the treatment of wastewater in the country, and generally the entire management of wastewater treatment in the country, in the Green Drop reports. This is the latest, the 2011 report. The previous one was the 2009. And what is quite interesting is if one compares the relative performance over those two reports. Now, the first report in 2009, it didn't have universal coverage. There were a number of, particularly municipalities. Most of these wastewater treatment works are operated by municipalities, which are referred to in the relevant legislation as water services authorities. So you'll see here that almost all of the municipalities were assessed in 2010. 156 municipalities operating a total of 821 wastewater systems. And possibly the most important figure there, a lot of that is fairly meaningless without quite a lot of detail being given, which I don't have time for. But the number of Green Drop reports, there's a score that's allocated to the performance of each wastewater treatment works. And you'll see there about just below halfway down, in 2010, 460 of the total of 821, total of 56% scoring less than 50% for the Green Drop score. Now, essentially what that means, there are a number of drivers and factors that are taken into account in reaching that score. Essentially what that means is that most of those wastewater treatment works would be emitting effluent post-treatment that doesn't comply with the relevant legal standards, and in some cases is way, way off the relevant legal standards. And that's not because the legal standards are unrealistically high, it's because there's little or no treatment that's actually taken place. So if one looks at that in some kind of graphic format, you'll see there the 56% in red and orange that are less than 50%. Many of the average performers in the black would also not be meeting those effluent standards. So what it means in real terms is that there's an enormous amount of untreated sewage that is ending up in our rivers and streams, which, as I said earlier, leads to, or it contributes to the eutrophication problems, and obviously has potential health risks in respect of the pathogens that are found in that untreated sewage. So what are the causes of this, or the problems that underlie it? Many of the problems lie in the fact that the water treatment works were established several years ago, mostly during the apartheid era, and were designed primarily to deal with what we could refer to as the white urban areas, and many of them haven't been upgraded. So you have water treatment works that are designed, for example, to deal with 50,000 people, where they are accommodating the sewage of 100,000 people, and that's a widespread problem throughout the country. In addition, many of these plants are not being adequately maintained. There's new technology that's available that's not being incorporated. Even the existing technology that is operating in these plants isn't being maintained. It's been estimated that between 30 and 40% of the relevant infrastructure isn't working properly. There's a lack of human resources, both skilled, that's the engineers. Estimates are that there are about a quarter of the number of engineers now working in the wastewater treatment sector that there were at the time of the transition from apartheid to post-apartheid South Africa in the mid-1990s. And even in many cases, there are lack of unskilled staff. So the sorts of people who take the debris away from the big filters before the water goes through the more sophisticated filtration problems. Often there's problems of stormwater intrusion. So whenever there's significant rainfall, a whole lot of the sewage just runs through the system and into the rivers. And obviously that's, again, a maintenance and infrastructure issue. Often breakdowns, pumping stations that break down, and the sewage then leaks out of those pump stations. Sometimes, but not always, as a result of a prevalent problem in South Africa of cable theft. So a lot of people don't have telephones because people keep on stealing the cables, selling it as waste metal. So that happens to the pumping stations and the sewage works as well. So what are the underlying causes of these problems? A lot of it is the legacy of the pre-1994 circumstances, in other words, the apartheid era. And it might be easy to say, well, surely the municipalities after 1994 should have realized that there were deficiencies in that respect and addressed them. But certainly my view is that sewage is unsexy. And it's also something that the average person doesn't see. As long as they can flush their toilet and it disappears, it's not their problem. If their lights go off, that's a different story. So there were better priorities as far as municipalities were concerned in respect of expenditure. So there's not enough budget. Wastewater treatment is not seen as a priority. Lack of human capacity, I've already mentioned, lack of engineers, and in many cases simply staff generally. Many municipalities are out of their depth, not only in respect of wastewater treatment, but in management and government and governance generally. And that's evidenced, for example, relatively recently, only 3 to 4% of municipalities obtain clean audits when their financial statements are audited by the Auditor General. And particularly in respect of wastewater treatment, inadequate supervision of municipalities, and I'll get back to that shortly when I look at the legal dimensions. So the legal issues, the general duties of wastewater authorities, as I said earlier, wastewater authorities, generally municipalities, and water services providers who in many cases are municipalities but don't have to be, those are generally the bodies that are responsible for wastewater treatment. And the general duties are set out in the Water Services Act, particularly in respect of provision of sanitation. But the duties are general. There's very little in respect of specifics that have to be accorded with. The specifics arise primarily in the context of supply of water and particularly drinking water. But there are no detailed duties at the moment in respect of, for example, the amount of money that should be set aside per person for sanitation purposes that could address issues of maintenance. There's no duties in relation to the qualifications of people who are operating wastewater treatment works and so on. There are a number of enforcement mechanisms that are available for what I've called normal pollution issues. The idea that pollution is usually caused by either a natural person or a corporate, not part of the government, where you have the government on one side that is protecting everybody's interests, prosecuting non-government entities for pollution. Unfortunately here, the polluters are government. And our problem is exacerbated by the fact, I say it's an impediment, but it's probably a good idea, that our constitution, and there's legislation that supports it, I'll speak a bit more about that later, requires so-called cooperative governance. The idea that different government bodies, before taking each other to court, need to sort things out through negotiation and other similar fora. Unfortunately, in respect of water, it seems that cooperative governance, instead of negotiating, it simply means hands off, which doesn't help anybody. Section 3 of the National Water Act, which is quite widely regarded as quite an innovative section that really underpins the whole of our water law. This is the National Water Act of 1998, so new South African legislation. Essentially provides for the government to be a public trustee. Exactly what that means at the moment hasn't yet been definitively ascertained. But what it means definitely, I think, is what appears in the second part of that clause, that the national government, acting through the minister, that's the Minister of Water Affairs, which is a national competence, must ensure that water is protected, used, developed, conserved, managed, and controlled in a sustainable and equitable manner for the benefit of all persons and in accordance with its constitutional mandate. Now, as far as I'm concerned, that can be interpreted, and it ought to be interpreted in a way that the National Minister of Water Affairs should be very concerned about what is happening in all the municipalities who aren't meeting the standards. Now, the National Department is doing something about it in the sense that they recognize there's a problem through this reporting, but what happens after the reporting is not all that clear. So it hasn't really yet been utilized as regards wastewater treatment. Now, what we can see, the huge expenditure that's required to get things back on track. The law is clearly not a solution. The estimates are that we're going to require about 500 billion rand, which when I wrote the paper was about 52 billion. It's round about 10 to 1 if you take what my exchange rate was when I changed rands for dollars at the airport. So it's an enormous amount of money, and that money isn't readily available from the municipalities. The municipalities, quite frankly, are not going to be able to pay for the backlog. So law isn't going to help with addressing the backlog. We do get to a situation where the existing problems are sorted out. There are also questions about how we're going to go on regulating it into the future. Will there be norms and standards that will be adopted in terms of compulsory maintenance, certain amounts of money being put aside depending on the population and so on. So there are various question marks about the effectiveness of the law in this situation, particularly given that we're dealing really with a legacy issue. The second aspect that I want to look at also involves quite a significant legacy issue, and that's acid mine drainage. Now, I'm not sure if everybody understands what acid mine drainage is, so very briefly, I'll attempt to explain it. When mining is going on, and the mining that we're talking about in this context is primarily gold and uranium, although it also happens in coal mines. When mining is going on, water is constantly being piped out of the mines because of the groundwater situation. If you didn't pump the water out, miners would have to wear scuba gear. But once the mine ends its useful life, the mine starts filling with water. And that water reacts with the minerals in these open areas that have been mined out and becomes acidic. And because it's acidic, it then picks up various other things like heavy metals and, in certain cases, radioactive elements as well. And if it's not pumped out, it keeps on rising and rising. Eventually it comes to the surface, and that is referred to as decanting. So when the acid mine drainage decants, it bubbles off out of the surface and then ends up in surface water supplies and has other negative effects as well. So primarily we're dealing with an issue that is problematic in the so-called Witwatersrand. I'll show you a map of that on the next slide. That's the Johannesburg and surrounding areas, although it's not confined to those parts of the country. It's involved elsewhere as well. There's a very large number of derelict and ownerless mines. Audits in 2009 suggested there were nearly 6,000 of these mines. The estimated cost in 2008 of rehabilitation, excluding treatment for acid mine drainage, around about 30 billion rand, again $3 billion. Short-term cost estimate just to deal with the problem, to stop it decanting basically, about 2.2 billion. Treasury, the National Treasury, has allocated so far 433 million. And pretty scarily, the potential volume in the Witwatersrand goldfields per day of acid mine drainage that is being generated is about 140 Olympic-sized swimming pools. Now clearly, that potentially, if it was treated, would be a water resource, so it's not all bad news. It's quite a lot of water. Okay, I forgot to point out on the bigger map earlier where Johannesburg was, but I think many of you know more or less where Johannesburg is. You can see it is very, very faint yellow in that map. And the three basins that are particularly problematic in terms of acid mine drainage, the western, the red, central, the grey, eastern, the blue. The eastern basin at the moment is not seen as particularly priority because it's still quite far away from the surface. In 2002, the western basin first decanted fairly near Krugersdorp, which is just at the top of the red piece there, and it ran off eventually into the Vaal River. One of the things that you can see from that map is that all of the rivers are running away because it's on Witwatersrand, means the White Waters Ridge. Johannesburg's on a ridge, so it's at the top of the catchment or watershed, whichever you prefer. So all of this pollution that's occurring there is heading off into various rivers, particularly the Vaal River system, which eventually runs into the Orange River. So just some of the statistics relating to the acid mine drainage. Water levels rising at approximately 0.6 meters per day in the central region, central basin. And you'll see there the central basin is right underneath Johannesburg, particularly under the CBD. So there's lots of companies whose basements are going to be flooded fairly soon. In May 2013, in other words, earlier this month, the water was 179 meters below the central basin. So you can work that out. 0.6 meters per day, 179 meters below. It's not even, well, just over a year, the water is going to be in the streets. And the Department of Water Affairs is frantically trying to get pumping going on in that area to avoid that problem. An expert report was released in December 2010 relating to AMD, and it was accepted by Cabinet late 2011. The Trans-Caledon Tunnel Authority, which previously has been concerned primarily with transfer of water from Lesotho into the Johannesburg and surrounding areas, is carrying out emergency measures which are primarily at the moment being carried out in the Western Basin. On the west, as it's called, the West Rand, the Western Basin, pumping is taking place, and it's being treated by means of a process called neutralization, which essentially means they're taking all the heavy metals out, and then they're releasing the residue into rivers and streams. And that residue, unfortunately, is full of sulfates, salts. And at the moment, apparently, it's being sufficiently diluted by the stream and river flow for it not to be too much of a problem. But it's not a sustainable situation, because as soon as we get into a drought situation, which is fairly frequent in South Africa, there will be excessive salt loads, and that obviously has enormous consequences in respect, for example, of irrigation. Now, from a legal point of view, these are regarded as emergency measures, so there's no EIA required for the pumping and the neutralization processes. But as I was pointing out, clearly we have to move on from that. Again, just less than a month ago, the Minister of Water and Environmental Affairs indicated that there was work going on in respect to the Western Basin, and this was the only thing that she said about acid mine drainage in her budget speech. Nothing there about the situation in respect to the Central Basin, which obviously for many people in Johannesburg is fairly scary. Now, what about the legal dimensions? Both the current mining legislation as well as past mining legislation provided for post-closure responsibility. But clearly, a lot of the consequences following on from mining were not adequately foreseen in respect of earlier legislation. So the current legislation, which is the so-called MPRDA, the Mineral and Petroleum Resources Development Act of 2002, is really not all that relevant in respect to the legacy problems that we have at the moment, because a lot of those mines were approved in terms of earlier legislation. The current Act requires environmental management plans to be accepted by, unfortunately, the Department of Mineral Resources, so it's Fox guarding the hen house, before any mining rights are granted. And there's also financial provision for rehabilitation that has to be paid by the mining rights holder before mining commences. I'll say a bit more about that shortly. Also relevant, the National Water Act. Water pollution is an offence, so this would be regarded as water pollution. Water use licensing would apply in respect of any activity basically that can adversely affect a water use from a water resource, so that would be ranging from extraction through storage to putting stuff into water, and that would require certain standards to be met in respect of various minerals that can be put into water, various other substances. Section 19 provides for a duty of care to stop anything that can adversely affect water, or to remediate anything that has already happened, and the department or the minister can issue directives in that respect, and there already have been a number of directives issued in respect of pumping water out of disused mines. Also relevant would be the National Environmental Management Act, which has a similar duty of care in section 28, also requiring persons to take steps to remediate past damage and new damage. The Minister of Environmental Affairs may issue directives requiring people to take steps, and this applies retrospectively. So this potentially would apply in respect of any of these mining situations. How is it actually being dealt with in terms of the law and liability? In terms of the expert report, essentially the idea is, let's address the problem first, pump out this water, and then we'll consider how to apportion the liability at a later stage. They are concerned about legal wrangling, I think understandably, delaying actually doing something about the problem, which, as I've already indicated, is pretty critical. When it does come to considering issues of liability and apportionment, clearly there are going to be problems of attribution. A number of the so-called derelict and ownerless mines might be derelict, but they're not actually ownerless. So that is actually a good thing, I suppose. But the attribution issues certainly going to be complicated in terms of attribution. A number of different mining companies, owners and so on, that will all be operating in fairly close proximity to one another, and decisions will have to be made as to who is liable proportionately. So obviously problems of ownerless mines, because ultimately the taxpayer will have to bear the burden of that. And at the end of the day, what it means is that the polluter pays principle, which is a principle of South African law, is undermined. Going forward, as I said, there are these provisions in the new legislation, the 2002 MPRDA. The WWF have done a survey to find that they're just not being implemented properly. For example, there's inadequate consideration of longer-term water issues in the environmental management plans, and clearly water issues on an ongoing factor, ongoing term are serious problems. and the guidelines by which the financial provision is calculated are not adjusted for inflation, together with a host of other problems which we don't have time to discuss here. So if we can draw some conclusions just in respect of those two particular problems, wastewater treatment and acid mine drainage, which are both having significant detrimental impacts on water, which is already quite scarce in the country. Some of these are fairly obvious. Law and papers not being enforced, the so-called implementation gap. Often there are understandable reasons for that. So it's not simply a case of the enforcement personnel not doing their jobs. The polluter pays principle, as I indicated, is being undermined. Clearly the message that one can get from both of these issues, given these legacy problems, is that prevention is better than cure, which is in keeping with the precautionary principle. Had the decision makers 20, 25, 30, even 100 years ago known more about these possible consequences or taken precautions against them, a lot of this could have been avoided. Sustainable development clearly requires better vetting of where mining takes place, so-called no-go areas, and I'll show you a map just to finish off after this slide to show you what I'm talking about. And then there's these problems of cooperative governance, the kind of hands-off approach where government bodies are often the problem underlying many of these pollution concerns. And clearly the nettle needs to be grasped in that respect. The so-called negotiation that is happening at the moment isn't yielding results. And a lot of the problem in respect to both of these things, as has been indicated in a number of sources that I've seen, is there's a lack of clarity as to who's responsible and a lack of clarity as to who's going to pay. And until those things get sorted out, there isn't going to be a significant improvement. The science relating to acid mine drainage is clear. What one does about it is clear. There's no problem with the technology in respect of addressing it, but it costs money, and the source of that money isn't clear. So just to conclude what I was saying about no-go areas, the map on the right is more or less the part of South Africa in the red circle. It's in Mpumalanga province. The white bit here on the right-hand map is Swaziland, so that's not part of the country. But you'll see there the freshwater ecosystem priority areas, so-called, in the country, the green areas, which, according to current national water policy, it seems that these will be declared as some kind of protected area, and one would hope that in those areas mining wouldn't take place. And if you see the amount of green in that particular area, and it's indicated in the right-hand map by the blue, and you superimpose on top of that areas where there's mining-related activity. So mining rights have been granted, or mining rights have been applied for, or mining is actually taking place. You'll see a significant amount of mining taking place on top of those blue areas. And clearly that's an unsustainable situation. Just for interest, to finish off, the green area on the right there where there's little or no mining is the Kruger National Park, so that's why there's no mining there, otherwise there'd be grey all over that area as well. So thank you very much.